start with the Milton Friedman Distinguished Service Professor in Economics, University of Chicago, Director of the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago, someone who has been working away on using markets to tackle environmental problems in all sorts of ways, and is someone who's good at talking to reporters and respects deadlines. That's Michael Greenstone, all the way over there. Gets points for that. Then sitting next to Michael, we have the global head of corporate advisory at JP Morgan, who spends his day explaining to clients how they need to channel money towards climate solutions, Rama Vardayankavo. Then two over from me, we have the executive director of the Blue Horizons Foundation, who clearly seems to be one of the most popular members of this gathering based on the time that we spent and how many people wanted to talk to Jane Flagle.
You have the word foundation.
And finally, immediately to my left, the former White House National Climate Advisor, Assistant to the President, and head of the White House Climate Policy Office, the individual who put a number of policies in place, some of which still survive, some of which have been rolled back in recent months, Elise Adey. So thanks to all of you for coming and participating in this panel. So I feel like obviously this is an interesting moment where markets are taking on outsized importance given what's happening in the policy sphere, both in the United States and abroad. And because we have enough time at this point to assess some of the successes and failures of markets in the context of climate change and environmental pollution, it's worth getting an assessment of some that really stand out as object lessons. And so, Michael, if I could start with you about what some of your research has shown on this front.
Sure. Thanks for having me on the panel. So what I was going to talk about, markets in the textbook case are really excellent at achieving whatever the environmental goal is, but doing it at low cost. And I think one area where they have not been used very much is actually in developing countries where the pollution problems are often the greatest. And so some work that I did with some colleagues was to, in India, was to ask the question, can markets work in developing countries? And we set out and ran as a randomized control trial, like you would run a drug test. Randomly assigned some firms to be in the market and some firms to continue to be regulated in the status quo way. And the results were really pretty remarkable. There was basically three. First, firms began to comply with the law. They didn't comply with the law before. The second is they greatly reduced their emissions. And the third is they reduced the cost of compliance. The markets reduced the cost of compliance for firms. And so why is that important and why is that, I think, relevant more broadly than just in India, is I think it underscores that as the world has increasing ambitions for environmental policy and climate policy, it's going to get more and more expensive to achieve those goals unless we really focus on the things that can do it at least cost. And so here we had, in an environment where I think there was great skepticism that this could work, a really terrific example. And that idea has worked, it has worked well in India, and it is now spreading across India. But I think it's an important reminder of the power of markets. And sometimes we get a little confused or about what the goal is. And if we really have ambitious environmental goals, I think it's a really important reminder.
Got it. And then now, of course, when you have markets and crediting, there's also sometimes geographic shifting and shifts across manufacturers when it comes to, obviously, the impacts. Ali, could you talk a little about how we've seen that and what have been some of the policy solutions aimed at addressing that?
Yeah, I think there's two ways that markets can attach, and they're not mutually exclusive. One is to shift sort of from the capacity that is the most efficient to help deliver the outcome, and the other is the place that is the most efficient to deliver that outcome. I found that the political economy around shifting around capacity has been really powerful. You look over the course of decades, with asterisk points during the Trump administration around the tailpipe standard that the Environmental Protection Agency promulgates. And you look at how that's really helped automakers both sort of smooth temporally within their own capacity to produce cleaner vehicles, but also do that across manufacturers. So delivering then a better product for the consumer and doing it in a way that actually reinforces their industrial strength. And you don't have to take the sort of US example as the validator for this approach. The Australians, after decades of dragging their feet, actually just put it into place and are seeing really positive results as well. So I think there, where you sort of deploy it against industrial capacity and actually use it as that means to deliver flexibility is really, really powerful. The place where I think there's real political economy challenge, and I think Michael advanced some case studies from India and elsewhere, but in the U.S., one of the things we've really struggled with is where that then leads to pollution being concentrated in places and reinforces pollution lock-in for communities that are bearing the brunt. So I think of, how do we deploy this market tool as a way to harness that efficiency? But we've got to have some of this other scaffolding to avoid the lock-in in places.
And just to follow up on that, and anyone who wants to chime in, that obviously California is one of the places that's really struggled with that, and as a state that's had cap and trade and then seen those shifts and obviously has responded to it. To what extent have those solutions worked? To what extent have we seen regulators capable of responding to it?
Yeah, and I'd love others to jump in on this. I think we've seen some real issues. The one is the sort of cross-border issue, and I think not just in the sort of intrastate context, but in the global context, we're finally catching up to carbon getting dumped somewhere else because you just tightened in one place. So I think that's one place where there's catch-up going on. I think the second is we've really struggled when we've loaded in these other policy preferences into the market mechanism and made the market mechanism more cumbersome. We've made it more frustrating for firms who are playing in the market. So, I think the California experiment where they've been able to build programs around the market, that's, I think, been largely successful. I think where they've tried to load it in, load those preferences into the actual mechanism, I think they've struggled to get the efficiency against all of the outcomes they're solving for. So I think it's a mixed bag coming out of California, honestly. But there's a path out of here that gets us to an efficient place where we can harness the mechanism.
So, I just want to intervene. I think Ali knows this better than I do, but I thought the California thing was fake news. There was a claim that it was exacerbating environmental justice concerns, and then when people dug into the data, it was actually reducing pollution more in poor neighborhoods. So, which it didn't have to be. So I guess I'd make one point, I don't even think it's true. Two, it's super easy inside of a market to have the permits have extra weight if they're being used in a particular neighborhood. And so it's just a design feature. So I find the whole thing super confusing that I don't think it's a valid critique.
Okay, Jen, please.
Yeah, if I could say, I think I agree, of course, that markets where well-designed and efficiently and effectively deployed can be a more efficient way to achieve environmental objectives in general. I do think that we've seen much more success. I do think we've seen much more success with the use of these markets in non-CO2 pollution domains, and this gets to one of the this gets to lots of things, but on the resource shuffling concerns, I think climate, my view is that in the 90s, we probably overlearned the success of pollution market solutions in domains like acid rain, for instance, and then just kind of ported that over to the climate change problem. And again, this is not to say that markets can't be, and markets for environmental pollution can't be useful in climate, but climate is a very different problem for lots of reasons. For one, obviously everyone in this room knows that what matters is global emissions reductions. So if you have a market in place A and it results in more emissions coming from place B, you've done nothing for the climate problem. So that's thing one. And that's a little bit unlike other more acute pollution control problems, obviously. It's also true that CO2 emissions, unlike lots of other emissions that we'd be concerned with in conventional pollution, are ubiquitous and a side effect of basically all economic activity right now. So it's just much more difficult to capture and price those emissions in a globally robust way. So again, this is not to like suggest that markets can't be useful. The third thing I'll say about climate, and it's related to the first 2 points, is we have now run the experiment of trying to design markets for CO2 in various places, and I, for one, think they have underperformed relative to the expectations of the textbook. I think that's probably a not super controversial point. That's not something inherent to using a market. It is, though, part of the challenge of building a market for an invisible pollutant that is global in nature, like, and where you have concentrated economic interests that stand to win or lose based on how these markets are designed, and a public that is, if we're being honest, not particularly enthusiastic about paying more for energy and other industrial goods in light of global climate. So all of these things, the result of all of this is just to say that it has been very difficult in practice to design markets for CO2 that have been as effective as the textbooks suggest they should be.
Okay, so I can't help, sorry, joining in here. I want to pick at that. Why do we think the CO2 markets haven't worked very well? And let's compare it to whatever the alternative is.
Oh yeah, I'm happy to have this fight.
So what is the alternative? It's some other regulation that
Not necessarily.
and somehow limits CO2. The spillover problem to the emissions going from jurisdiction A to jurisdiction B, that doesn't disappear because you use
With a regulatory intervention,
yeah.
I agree.
So
I think,
so that's off the table
well,
as a critique.
okay.
And then just panels are better when people disagree.
We're all in favor of spicy panels.
Yeah.
please.
I mean,
So that's off the table. So what's left is how have the existing CO2 markets underperformed? I don't understand. I know
well,
that's a common
there are
critique, and I'm
very. I mean, I would love for you to point to carbon markets that exist in the voluntary or compliance domain that have had a price that matches the level economists say is desirable to drive decarbonization.
Okay, but that is a design feature.
That's what I said.
No. So that's just saying that policymakers had low ambition.
Sure,
compared
but
to,
isn't this
And
what
then
I
that
just
plays
said?
out in
That
the
is
real
what I
world
just said.
market,
I said it's
right?
not inherent to the nature of a market, but the political economy of designing the market so it actually achieves what you want it to achieve is a central question in the real world.
But I think the alternative, I guess, is like a hidden regulation that the public doesn't understand.
Well, or
that raises costs more than the market. And it's just I have a hard time thinking
I do
that's
think
our
this.
path.
I actually do think. Look, we'll agree on this. I do think to the extent we're doing CO2 restriction in the form of regulatory interventions or supply side fossil restrictions of various kinds that are not in a pure market form, I agree that it basically is a hidden carbon price and that's not good. So I shouldn't say that's not good, but that is basically what it is. And there are consequences of taking that approach, economic consequences and pollution. So I'm not advocating for that. I've been much more bullish to date on the kind of investment-led approach. So we've been talking about markets for pollution, but we could also talk about markets for electrons and markets for industrial goods. I've been much more bullish on, today anyway, an investment-led approach to driving decarbonization that lowers the cost of clean energy technologies both here and around the world to try to accelerate decarbonization, which isn't to say you never have a market, but I think we have lessons that we've learned about how difficult it is to design an effective market for this today.
Excellent, and I'd love Rama to weigh in at this point. As someone who's engaged in this market and is seeing this kind of investment led effort. Can you talk about what you've seen in
This
practice?
is emblematic of the problem we have, right? You have deep subject matter experts debating foundational issues, and capital is sitting quiet.
Exactly, which is why you need to
Because we
speak.
have no conviction that you guys know what you're talking about. Why would we invest? My view is, look, even suboptimal policy, if it is held consistently, both temporally and across regions, is far better than perfect policy in a small place. I think Ali, you said California is a mixed bag. It's a disaster, right? Pretty much across every aspect. So while Michael's work is inspiring, and especially what he's doing in India is interesting, I am 100% with Jane. I think right now, if you have to take stock, markets have not delivered. Right? If the ultimate goal is to achieve decarbonization, or the step before that, capital formation to achieve decarbonization, we are failing abysmally. Right? We, as a capital provider, have no conviction to invest because we have no idea. Right? We, JP Morgan, we buy a lot of carbon offsets. We are paying through our nose. That is not a rational decision at the end of the day. It's a value signaling, right? Part of it is value signaling. Part of it is we think this is, these are not big dollars. And if we can help, catalyze the market, we can do it. It's a trophy asset. It's like, we could buy the LA Lakers, we're buying carbon offsets, right? Same idea. It's just not in
LA
the market
Lakers
right
might
now,
be a better
right?
investment.
So I think we, I think we are talking, again, second order, third order details. We need to zoom out a little bit.
And one, I think, it's easy to sort of dismiss the political part of this as adjacent to the conversation. But if what we're trying to solve for is something that sticks, then you got to spend a lot of time thinking about, well, is there a relative perception that certain communities are bearing more of the brunt in California or not? What does that mean for the durability? Is there a sense that the investment is leading, even if it's being maybe undergirded by market-based mechanism or regulatory scaffolding? Does that help? Does that actually hurt because people think it's too rich for the fiscal position the country's in? How does that sustain? So the political economy questions, I think, unfortunately, are equal to the efficacy questions, because what you're trying to do is facilitate capital formation in the trillions of dollars, and you can't do that with any one of these programs operating on its own. You got to pull the capital off the sidelines.
Right. And Michael, you want to weigh in? Seriously.
Oh, so I'm not sure Ram and I are talking about the same thing. I'm talking about, and Jane and I, California compliance market. There's a price. That price has existed for 10 or 15 years. There's futures contracts out 8 years. That's a signal that people should be able to invest against that signal. So I'm a little confused about your dismissiveness. And then if you're talking about voluntary carbon markets, that's a completely different animal. Those things are wild and unregulated and unstructured, and I'm very sympathetic to that. But on the compliance markets, which I think Jane and I were going back and forth, there's been a clear price signal.
At a level that doesn't make any sense, but yes.
No, what does that mean at a level that doesn't make any sense?
Too low. Like, what's the level? Where is it at today?
Okay, so I think it's about $35 a ton. Sure, I think the proper price is probably $225 a ton, but that's just saying, it's a backwards way of saying, oh, I wish California policymakers were more ambitious.
It's not, because I think even at 35, they are clearly an outlier, and suffering the consequences of that. We are not living in a world where they can go to 25.
Look, I'm no great fan of California, but outlier compared to what? In the EU, the price is $70, $80.
Talk about places where economic progress is happening.
It's like $15 or $20. In the rest of the world, it's zero. So to me, California, I view that as way more than half full.
But where is climate investment actually happening, right? It's happening in China. Right? About 40% of all climate investments in the world is happening in China. About 80% of all climate investment is happening in places where there is no compliance market, so it doesn't matter. So you guys, this is play money. Who cares what Europe is doing?
That's all. I would say most of that is driven by government policy. And I think the broad point I'm trying to make is the use of policy besides markets on a per ton basis often ends up being much more expensive. I'm not making a deeper point in that. When you try to get reductions through approaches that are not markets, regulatory markets or mandates or whatever you want to call them, it just ends up being more expensive for the economy. So yeah, if the government in China, if President Xi Jinping says that we should have more EVs, they're going to have more EVs. That doesn't mean that it was on a cost-effective basis.
And Rama, would you agree with that? That much of what's happening in China is driven through government policy, or it'd be
100%, but it's in subtle ways, right? So I was just in China 2 weeks back.
Yeah.
I was in China for a week, and then I was in India. Came back very enthusiastic about those places, and then read the newspaper over the weekend here and felt completely depressed. The kinds of headlines, kinds of things we are fighting over in this country is just depressing. It's subtle, right? And it's interesting. In China, you kind of go around Beijing and Shanghai, you see all the green license plates, right, which are the EVs, and the blue ones are the ICEs. They have no tax incentive, the way I understand it. They simply, to register an ICE takes like 10 times longer, just time-wise, than to register an EV. It's very subtle, but very effective. You want a car, you want a car. You don't want to wait 10 weeks to get the registration, right? So they are being very clever without actually adding on to their fiscal burden by creating these incentives. And oh, by the way, the BYD is the best car there is today at a reasonable price range, right? Bar none. So it's not as if, the cost to the economy point, I'm not sure if I am forced to drive a BYD, I actually think I'll be better off than driving whatever I drive today in the US.
And just one broad follow-up question on that, which is that in terms of the global landscape for climate solutions, and I'd be interested, maybe Rama, you could go first, and then if others have it, where do you see capital flowing? I mean, again, you've obviously sketched out some of China, maybe in terms of other places, and I'd be interested in other folks of where's the capital going, and to what extent is it being driven by market mechanisms?
Again, I think about 40-45% of the action is in China, I think. About 15% or so is in the US, 15-20% in Europe, I would say. The remaining is rest of the world. China is a different world, let's say, but if I go to India, India is entirely, I think, market mechanisms. Combination, I would say, market mechanism and a realization of the geopolitical realities of the world today. Right? If you're in India today, you know that you have no energy security of your own. There is no real fossil resources. Your old friends are perhaps unreliable going forward. Some new friends are turning out to be quite unreliable as we stand today. And so you're saying, I don't care how much it costs. I need to invest in things like battery storage and nuclear. There is no other option. And it doesn't matter what the cost is today. That's where I go. So India, I would say I'm very optimistic about. Europe, it's just unfortunately a mess. So many policy missteps. And the focus on regulation, and again, I'll give you a very tangible example. What's happened over the last 18-24 months is, and if you're a European multinational company with assets outside of Europe, let's say in the US, in a carbon intensive sector, you have to get rid of that asset in the US. Really, it doesn't make any financial sense for a European multinational to operate assets outside of Europe in carbon intensive sectors, because the cost burden that Europe imposes on you to be a European parent company and operating assets outside Europe is prohibitive. If you're a cement company based in Europe, but you have to compete in the US, and you have to go through all the various CBAM and ETS and SFDR and CDDD and blah, 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 and you have to compete with a US company that has none of that, you'll never win business. And so we are seeing that in sector after sector, in carbon intensive sectors, where European companies are saying, how do I either get rid of my US assets or actually become a US company? Notwithstanding all the other issues that's going on with US and Europe, right? Tariffs and otherwise. So it's a mixed bag. And in the US, again, there is the pre-IRA world, right? And there is the post-IRA world, and there is the post, I guess, OBBBA world. And the lack of consistency and the whipsaw effect has meant that there is really no capital formation. And we'll see whether this kind of, the current world we are living in actually ends up being a stable world. By the way, I think there is a lot in my mind to appreciate about what the big bill does in terms of policy objectives. I think if, again, the solar and wind industry has been saying for a long time that they're the cheapest provider of power. Okay, prove it without incentives, right? And if you are in nuclear or geothermal or carbon capture, which are more yet to be advanced, it makes a ton of sense as a taxpayer for me to support that rather than just rooftop solar. So I think while it seems like this bill was a body blow to IRA, I think there is a lot of positives in this if we stick with it. And another year or two, and then I think we'll start seeing capital flow.
Jane, I know you have a couple thoughts on that. Would you say?
Yeah, I
something
mean,
on
well, I think one of the hypotheses underpinning the Inflation Reduction Act was about tackling the political economy constraints of all of this sort of head on, and by leading with a more investment-led strategy, public investment to draw in private investment, you would grow the concentrated economic interests who stand to benefit from an accelerated energy transition, right? And that's sort of like on a kind of cross-partisan basis. Now, I think we all know that capital likes certainty, and I totally agree. The sort of whipsawing that's happened historically on climate, where you get a Democratic administration that enacts a bunch of regs, and then a Republican administration that rescinds all the regs, and then I would actually argue, despite the fact that I think OBBB, the Republican tax bill, is in many ways quite a bad piece of legislation, on the climate front, we saw much more durability than we would have had the US government taken an executive-only approach to climate action under Biden. So I think this point about before the IRA, we had the situation where there were solar and wind tax credits that kept expiring and getting extended and expiring and getting extended. We didn't have any tax credits for a lot of these other zero carbon technologies. We didn't have 45X, which is a tax credit for manufacturing technologies. Like, but there is a lot in that bill that persists despite the irrational outcome of the Republican legislature on solar and wind specifically. And I take your point that they are the more commercial technologies, and as a result, subsidizing their deployment is more expensive than doing other things. But in general, I actually think that what remains of the IRA speaks to the political durability of this kind of strategy on climate.
I agree with that.
Got it. Okay. I wanted to ask about a different mechanism, which is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Given that that is certainly at a moment when there's kind of limited discussions of new policies that relate to climate, this is one that certainly has been discussed by some Democrats and Republicans in Washington, and would love to know what you all think of that as a possible approach.
I think that we need some framework globally that helps take advantage of the jurisdictions that are pushing out in front and puts pressure on the jurisdictions that are dragging their heels. And I think there's been some validation that that concept can resonate in a diverse set of jurisdictions. So you see the Canadians dropped some stuff with Carney stepping up, but one of the things they picked up was some resolve to try to build a mechanism that's going to sync up with the Europeans. The UK has stepped into that and vowed to sync up with the Europeans. In the Asia Pacific, you've got the Australians now thinking about how that might help them internalize some of the benefit of their energy resources rather than shipping those resources as well as the raw minerals into the Chinese market. And you go to places like India and you have a conversation with the people who are forward-looking in terms of their industrial capacity, and you've got a steel industry and others that are actually taking a cue off of Europe. And part of what Rama described, the renewed interest in nuclear and other similar technologies, part of that is driven by playing a competitive game globally where they can deliver cleaner goods relative to others. So I think that's a lot of proof points against the mechanism. And if you have that architecture, different countries are going to have different politics around whether they're taking an investment-based approach an investment-led approach or not, and that's going to depend on their fiscal position, so on. What we need is a global mechanism that tethers us all together and actually drives us forward, which is why, I think if there's a global climate discourse that's going to probably make the most progress over the next 5 to 10 years, is probably the G20, not the UN climate process.
Michael.
Yeah, so I want to start with a thread that I think is across all this entire conversation, and I think each of us have made it one way or made this point one way or another, and that is a core problem of climate policy is that there's no one setting global climate policy, and so then as a consequence, you in country A you have lots of policy, in country B you have none, and the carbon emissions move there, and what good was that in the end? And so, for those of you who are not in total wonk land, a CBAM, or Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, basically says, and the EU is the group pursuing it, it basically says, if you're going to import into our country, you have to have a carbon price equal. If you're going to bring steel bars in, it's not fair for those steel bars not to have been produced without a carbon price, so you're going to have a carbon price, or we're going to levy it at the border. And there's a lot of intuitive appeal to that. Full stop. Let me make a second point. 80% of CO2 emissions for the rest of the century are projected to occur outside the OECD countries. And so I find, and I find this in my discussions in India and China and elsewhere, that there is a predatory, there's a predatory element to the CBAM, which is, you kind of got to see it from their perspective. Like, hey, you guys did all this stuff. There's all this crap in the atmosphere now. It's getting really hot. We're poor. We're actually located in the bullseye for climate damages. And wait. Now you want us to have a tax on our carbon emissions? Like, it sounds like, climate imperialism is what it sounds like. And so, yes, I think there should be a global carbon policy. Do I think it should be done by punishing the very countries who are kind of the victims, by and large? As a moral issue, economists don't really have morals. As a moral issue, I would say no. But like as a pure utilitarian, I have very low belief that that can work. They're going to resist it. They're going to find ways around it, as they should. It is an awesome lawyer employment act. When I was in the Obama White House, we looked into this. Like, you could have lawyers fighting for years about what the carbon content was of a steel bar from India, and if it was produced in factory A versus factory B versus factory C. And Jane brought up the shuffling. What will happen is you'll have the cleanest guy from India bring it in. It's like, I think it's a false god. Yes, the core problem is we don't have global policy, but it's a predatory and mean and nasty false god.
I think there's so much to respond to in that.
And thankfully, the panel's only 23 more.
The most value-laden thing I've heard from Michael Greenstone. But I think there's the whole world, and I think you're right to note. There's a whole group of Pacific Island nations that if we impose the carbon border adjustment on them first, that would be incoherent, both for the policy we're trying to drive, but also for the effort of bringing countries together. But then you've got, I think, you lumped in China with that group of nations, and that's why I said G20, because I think you gotta have a policy that puts downward pressure on those emissions. It's great that they have those license plates in China, but the steel they're sending everywhere else has got a bunch of embodied carbon in it. And I think there's a resonance to the concept of fairness that's embodied in what has been otherwise a challenging set of trade decisions to process here domestically. But there's an aspect of it that appeals to this fairness question in the United States, which I think a border adjustment seeks to answer. We're working really hard on a global problem. What is the world's biggest polluter doing about it? And saying we're not going to put the gloves on, we're not going to bring to bear market forces to put downward pressure on their emissions. We're not going to say you can dump carbon everywhere, and there are no consequences. That I think is it's hard to tie your hands behind your back in that way, going into what remains a very critical time for the world to try to get on course.
I totally agree. And I think a way to get a lot more credibility so that it doesn't appear predatory and it doesn't appear abusive is maybe the rich countries of the world would actually compensate. Like, remember, damages are not spread.
China's the one being predatory in the global
The
trade.
damages are not being spread equally around the planet. They're primarily landing in around the equator in poor and hot places.
Yeah.
So like, I think if there was a little carrot and not just stick, I think it could go a lot further. Now,
Yeah, I mean, for
and
starters,
by the
we should
way,
bring
do I
back
think
the
China should be
development
treated
agency.
exactly the same as sub-Saharan Africa? No. Do I think it should be treated the same as India? Absolutely not. But just I can't help but resist this. Just so everyone knows with the CBAM, the idea isn't just that the steel bar made in sub-Saharan Africa, when it reaches the EU, faces the price. It's the EU is, at least I think it's not fully official. The aim is to require that all steel production in the sub-Saharan African country, even if it's just for domestic consumption, face a price. I mean,
They're also doing this while, by the way, handing out a great deal of free allowances to the industries that they're purporting to apply this to. So I mean, this, maybe it's a design issue. I do think there's a way. I do think
this is what we call Jane a convert.
I do think what we cannot do is turn our head to the fact that roughly half of our industrial pollution problem is embedded in traded products that are flowing across borders. Like, on
Totally
the substance of climate, like, we do need to find a better way to design a trade regime that tackles that directly. I share the concern about least developed countries, and I don't have an answer to that other than carrots, which seems crazy given our current. I mean, it's crazy to talk about fairness in trade given what's currently happening right now. So, but I take your point. Like, I think it would be crazy to design any kind of trade and climate tool that doesn't attend to the concerns about least developed countries who are going to be most impacted by climate change itself. But that requires a broader set of tools than just the tariff stick, which is possible. Look, you could have a border adjustment and have some fraction of the revenue associated with that border adjustment go toward a fund to invest in least developed countries. Like, there are ways to think about doing it that would be a little more fair, plausibly.
Okay, and I'd like to ask a question which actually comes out of the morning, the panel on carbon removal, which was quite interesting, which is that one of the things when you look forward a few decades is that if you look at some of the most promising carbon removal technologies that were discussed, including rock weathering and open ocean alkalinity adjustments, those things are not precise in terms of measurement. And as we've obviously seen, and again, I think everyone could speak to this, if you have a lot that you need precision when you're talking about crediting, and I'm just curious of if those are some of the most promising ways to actually remove carbon from the atmosphere. What do you do about the fact that it's hard to calculate?
This was a huge. I spent some time after I left the White House at Frontier, which was the world's first advanced market commitment for permanent carbon removal. I'm actually, despite that there's like a ton of shenanigans in the voluntary market, I find it less offensive than the compliance markets, frankly, because it is just basically a version of corporate philanthropy, so whatever. I will say, like, so we spent all of this time trying to figure out, we're trying to get corporates who could today make a net zero commitment and go buy a bunch of $4 a ton offsets, which we have through our various accounting mechanisms in voluntary carbon land, basically asserted that $4 offset is the equivalent of a pulse of fossil fuel emissions into the air. It is not. There is no way that it is. If you are trying to scale carbon removal in a framework where you are kind of after that equivalence question, you're trying to make these tons totally fungible, it is very hard to do that in an uncertain system. So one of my favorite examples is for enhanced rock weathering, for instance, where you're accelerating the process that happens naturally where rocks weather and draw down CO2 over very long time scales. That's actually what controls most of the carbon budget of the Earth. To accelerate that process, you can grind them up, increase the surface area of those rocks, put them in damper environments to accelerate the weathering process, whatever. We know that in most circumstances, almost all circumstances, that is reducing CO2 from the atmosphere. Like, we know it's a good thing to do. In my view, we should just be doing that. We should just find any way to do that. But we have been so committed to the notion that the way to do carbon removal is through carbon markets that we are tying ourselves in knots to quantify every uncertainty associated with this process of enhanced rock weathering so that Microsoft can make a claim that a ton of enhanced rock weathering is equivalent to a ton of emissions from a natural gas facility powering a data center, and therefore they can be net zero. It's ridiculous. It's just like not a way of tackling systematic climate change through corporate action. So that's one of the real concerns I have about fetishizing markets, especially for carbon removal.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, right? We should stop obsessing about the precision of these things and accept that we just don't know, and we should accept that maybe there'll be a small minority who will take advantage of it. There'll be fraudulent behavior. Sure, there's fraudulent behavior everywhere anyhow. Who cares, right? The vast majority of people will act in good faith, and they may be right, they may be wrong. But what's happened is because of this fetishization, what is the word you used?
Whatever.
It's a good word, right word. We have come to a point where there are like 5 people in the world who actually participate, who feel like they have a credibility surplus that they can take a hit piece in The Guardian, right? And we are, by the way, borderline, right? You know, we have to stop doing that. We have to allow kind of this, again, to go from being a trophy asset to something that everyone should want to participate in and feel like what they're doing in good faith will not come and kind of bite them in the backside later on. So I think this notion, this is obsessing over false precision that we have to stop doing.
And it's fine, like invest in trees. I'm not anti-tree. Go plant trees, save trees, whatever. But where the trouble is the claim making, the specific claim making that activity offsets your pulse of fossil fuel emissions, which is what a carbon market requires.
Michael, do you have thoughts?
I completely agree. The voluntary carbon market has not worked so hot. I think let's come back to 2 core problems. There's 2 core problems in the world with respect to climate. It's very simple. One, people don't have to pay for emitting CO2 in the atmosphere, basically anywhere in the world, possible with the exception of California, the EU, and Reggie, and a couple places. So that's an enormous problem. The second is the technologies really aren't up to the task in most cases. And so we should be investing like mad in R&D, and we could call R&D various things, which I think the Biden administration did a lot of great work on, and hoping to bring down the cost. So that's the lens through which I view all this. Is it solving one of those 2 problems? Now, let me turn to the voluntary carbon market. I think until there is actually a ton of when you transact for a ton, you know, if you went to the grocery store and put 12 apples in your bag and you came home and there were 4, you might go back a second time. And if there were 3 the second time, or even 4, you'd probably be like, that's not the grocery store for me. And that's basically the voluntary carbon market. And so until you can come home with the 12 apples, it's just going to be a cute curiosity. JP Morgan earns enough that it can do it. Microsoft earns enough that they can do it. I like to say the monopolies. JP Morgan's not a monopoly, but some of the tech companies are monopolies. Basically, it's great. They can do it. But it's a cute curiosity. With respect to their work through Frontier, which I really, really admire, they're serving the R&D function and helping us move down the cost curve. Wonderful. But I really have a much harder line view on the voluntary carbon markets if they're ever going to be anything besides cute that you can pet, which is you got to come home with the 12 apples. And if you don't, we're just wasting time.
Okay, and you can say something quickly, and then I want the audience to have a chance to prepare your questions. Go
Right.
ahead.
I think one of the reasons why we're all so down on the voluntary markets is because they tend to underinvest in the enabling infrastructure. So enabling infrastructure may be the R&D, the actual technology platform, taking advantage of what exists, but not really moving the ball on the thing we need. The enabling infrastructure may be the MMRV regime, the measurement, monitoring, verification regime that makes sure that this is actually putting the 12 apples in the bag. And I think that is either a government function, or we just need to applaud more the companies that do the sort of investment in the stock rather than just grab the flow. And I think that's what's good about some of this carbon capture investment through Stripe and others, where, you know, if you're paying $400, $800 a ton, you're not, you know, buying apples anymore. you're planting the orchard. So it's a totally different ballgame. The Inflation Reduction Act obviously included almost $500 million in MMRV. So I think that's where, you know, I do think we could harness this tool, but we've just got to be investing a lot more in the enabling infrastructure.
Okay, so if you have a question, please just raise your hand and a mic will come to you, I'm sure, or I'll give you mine. There we go. I think actually right there she raised her hand. Perfect. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Emma. Hello. Hi, Emma Fisher with Climate Cabinet. Thank you all. Jane, you mentioned feeling more bullish about markets for electrons versus carbon, and I wanted to go back to that and specifically ask about the role of states in opening or supercharging markets for clean electricity, or shutting them down, especially in this era of federal chaos and retreat. I know right now there are huge fights over the electricity grid in Virginia, opening the code of the Virginia Renewable Portfolio Standard, in Illinois, in Texas, and just curious how you all are thinking about the electron markets and the role of states in the U.S. in this next era of our state politics.
Yeah, I think you gotta have states playing hardball on the design, on regulatory approaches, in addition to just creating the conditions everyone can thrive. And if you go around, you talk to the leading developers in the United States of renewable energy who've been in the market for the last, call it 15, 20 years, they tell you the scaffolding that was laid by those initial renewable portfolio standards helped them perhaps more than the Bush era production tax credit. And that's because it helped them compete. It helped them get elbow room at the table, which wouldn't have been just foregone by the incumbents. So now the question becomes, well, do we just need that sort of RPS development? I think no, because that part of the market in many places has been cleared up by the progress we've made over the last several decades. But when you look at the 24/7 power, the stuff that you're going to need to decarbonize the sort of back end of the economy, there I do think you need more than just, you know, sort of weak incentive development. I think you need policymakers who are going to engage on really pulling these technologies into the marketplace, because otherwise the combination of the inertia and the incumbency is just going to keep them on the sideline. So I think, you know, it'd be really easy to say, oh, you know, RPS is the way to go. It probably isn't in a lot of places, but we do probably need portfolio style approach to get the 24/7 to get done.
Ali, could you talk a little bit? I bet you know the most about this. I think New York State, where you used to work, has flirted with having a carbon adder in its auctions. I don't know what the status of that is.
Yeah, I think
That would be like, you know, economist's dream, which probably means most people aren't going to want it. But
yeah, look, that's floated around in the New York has the benefit of having one ISO, so that's floated around there for a while. It goes back to, I think, a point Jane made about just people's inability to sell, I think for good reason, the adder being passed through and the consumer affordability challenges. But I just don't think, even when we were kicking that around in New York, we still had to have this conversation of what do you do to get the nukes to stay online or bring new nukes. New York struggled with capacity additions to hydropower. So I think we really struggle to finance the north-south transmission lines just based on the market price, and we actually had to create a whole new auction program to subsidize those costs. So
let me just play the role here. Like, I don't care about nuclear. I don't care about wind. I don't care about solar. I care about carbon. And so I'm like with you. I'm in the first pew of the church.
Yeah.
And then it felt like, oh, you swapped it out.
No,
and said, actually, what I cared about was nuclear.
And
I don't care about
think
nuclear.
You care. The challenge, and I'm going to characterize your position. Tell me if I'm wrong. You care about the carbon that's being emitted by the users, not just the carbon intensity of the energy that's going into the system. And for the users to be able to draw down their carbon, they're going to need it with different types of attributes. And so all of a sudden, while you didn't care whether the solar was throwing the electricity on the system or the nuclear was throwing the electricity on the system, you get sucked into the game of managing a better portfolio, because what you care about, laser focused, is just giving users what they need to be able to reduce their emissions.
It just sort of goes back to the fungibility argument. Like solar and storage is not the same thing as clean dispatchable power available 24/7. So at a systems level, you do need incentives to have a portfolio of sort of clean dispatchable resources and weather-dependent resources and whatever for carbon, because otherwise the whole system collapses. I guess one thing I want to say about the state stuff, and I'll go probably even further than Ali, is like, I'm a little anxious because we've had this tendency in the federal conversation to, when stuff goes not the way we want it to go in the climate community, everyone swings back to the states, and we're like, okay, pound Democrats to take the most aggressive position on climate in the blue states. And like that, I have some real skepticism about as a long-term political strategy. And I agree with Ali's points about the relative marginal impact of just going back to RPSs. If we do not take seriously the affordability and demand growth challenges this country is going to face on electricity over the next couple of decades, we have an opportunity to take advantage of that to build a ton of clean power. And if we screw this up, it will halt climate progress for a very long time. We cannot have the only states that are deploying clean power be blue states with exceedingly high electricity rates. That cannot be the model for decarbonization. And it's not in Texas, by the way.
Raman's going to chime in, and then we're going to get to another.
Quickly, two observations. One, if you plot the rate of electrification and the rate of decarbonization across different places, where the US lags more is in the rate of electrification, not in the rate of decarbonization. We need to electrify more things and worry about decarbonization later. The second is, again, first time in 20 years, we're going to see power demand actually go up in this country. So shifting the debate from replacing fossil power with clean power to, adding clean power to an existing base is an easier debate to have. And I'll tell you, when we talk to our clients, sure, the headlines are, I'm going to keep my coal plant longer or gas longer. But the reality is, I'm quite optimistic based on talking to utilities that if you fast forward 10 years and look back, if this AI data center hype is real, I think this will be the catalyst that changes the dynamic. I think we will add a lot more clean power.
I'm sorry, you had a question? Wait. The mic's going to come to you. Thank you.
My name is David. I'm with Food System Innovations, hint. As is so many of our climate discussions, we end up talking about energy and the grid and things like that. And it's my understanding that we could completely decarbonize the energy sector, production sectors, and without addressing the food sector, we can't meet Paris climate goals. So I'm just wondering, this may not be your area of expertise, which is fine, but do any of you have any thoughts about specifically decarbonizing the food sector?
I think there's certainly something, I agree with you. I think the climate community far too often ignores ag because it's really hard. It's just really hard. Obviously, we did, National Climate Advisor Zaidi did a lot on ag and climate in his time in the White House. I guess we have been thinking about this in a couple of ways. One, there's like an intersection with industrial decarbonization on fertilizer decarbonization, which is something that we've been spending a lot more time thinking about that I think is underattended to on the innovation agenda. And then, I think, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity there. And the USDA funding for climate stuff in IRA fared very well. I actually think it got increased in OBBB A. So I think it's another area where there's like a lot of possibility for bipartisan support. The thing is, you have to be careful that the stuff that you're incentivizing is actually decarbonizing and not. The thing with ag is a little bit like the biofuels thing Zeke was talking about, which is like you once you start talking to me about indirect land use change, I'm basically like, oh my god, and that I think we really have to grapple with how to think about that. But there's certainly a role for markets there too, potentially.
Can I just pick up on the indirect land change? In my very first day in the White House in 2009, there was some policy they were talking about, and they said, "Okay, we're going to release a bunch of carbon now by cutting trees or something or other, and then we're going to pay it back like over 80 years or something." And I was like, "Okay, you sure about that?" And I think what it we're all playing here with one arm tied behind our back here because Jane has to have a view, or Ollie had to have a view in the White House, or the NCAA had a view on ag and on steel and on this and on that. And it's just a really sharp contrast with the theme of this panel, which is, hey, I don't know all that stuff. I don't know indirect land use. I don't know exactly what's going to happen to steel plants. And so let's focus, instead of like trying to Soviet style micromanage what's going to happen in each sector, let's focus on the one thing we really care about, and that's carbon. And we have a really, really good tool available to do that. That's called markets. They don't care about nuclear. They don't care about solar. They don't care about ag. They only care about carbon. And I would say that is part of their advantage. With all due respect to Ollie and Jane's knowledge about indirect land use, you don't have to have people in the White House who understand that. You just have to set up a system, which is very hard. And Ollie made the most important point about the political economy, that can survive.
Okay.
May I?
Okay,
One?
Okay, go ahead.
I mean, Michael is the Milton Friedman Professor of Economics. That's like being the Pope John Paul Professor of Theology at Notre Dame or something. But I'm going to disagree with him regardless. Look,
Your
I think
problem set
obsessing.
will be available in the hallway later tonight.
There we go. I think obsessing about carbon is actually the wrong narrative. I think the problem in ag, the primary issue is food waste, right? We waste an enormous amount of food. If you take that out, I think the carbon problem solves itself. I'm a born vegetarian, so easy for me. But all of my friends who are forced to eat the cell-grown or the lab-grown burgers, and they're like, it's never going to work. You're forcing bad products on people and asking them to change behavior. Terrible idea. One positive note, methane. Right? I think we are spending more time on methane than literally anything else. And again, obviously both in the oil and gas patch, but also in ag. So again, happy to talk separately. The focus on methane is actually real, the momentum is real, and the capital formation actually very good.
Okay, and we're out of time, but first I'm going to give one plug for my friend Mike Grunwald's book, which came out this month, We Are Eating the Earth. If you really want to know what's going on that topic, it's a great book. I'm biased, but it's still good, even though he's only given up beef and hasn't gone as far as one would obviously do. It also, as following up on Rama, it's why composting is more effective than recycling, as some people know. But then last question, obviously this is really difficult work. Just maybe two of you can tell me something that makes you optimistic. Not all of you, because we're already over time.
Well, I think the decline in renewable and battery prices has been remarkable. And we're reaping the benefits of it left and right. Just remarkable.
You focus on the issue among young people, like I have a 19-year-old who's obsessed about the issue. I mean, just the human capital aspect, we talk about financial capital, but the human capital dedicated to the problem makes me very optimistic.
All right, they're so succinct. I'll let both of you guys say if you have
Oh
anything.
man, I thought I was off the hook. No, I mean, I think that's right. I think about climate as like a race against two feedback loops. One is the feedback loops in the climate system that are bad and scary, and one is the feedback loops of politics and economics and technology on the ground. And I feel like on the latter front, despite all these political headwinds, the feedback loops are accelerating, and that gives me optimism.
I think that notwithstanding the political noise in Washington, both in the US and certainly globally, we finally entered a period where the sort of right track on climate and the right track on growth have lined up. You certainly see this in the Chinese economy, which is being driven by the big three technologies, in terms of growth, but you see it in a bunch of other places. I think that is what we need to harness. We finally set up to play the game we want to.
Got it. Will you please join me in thanking these very talented